When people catch something scary with sharp teeth and completely unknown to science, it can get on your freaking nerves. Every newly discovered monster serves as a reminder that something even creepier might be lurking in the waters of the world's oceans. Although, just how horrible can the creatures made by nature be? And is there any limit to that? In February 2019, an angler, T. Hawken, pulled a creature out of Mary River in Australia. It looked like a monster from a horror movie. 6 inches long, with no eyes, but with razor-sharp teeth which looked like glass. Yes, the monster could also bite. You wouldn't want to touch it, and the angler had to try really hard to get rid of the strange creature. Apparently, it got stuck to the lure, so the angler had to use pliers. It was the only way, because it was impossible to shake the creature off. It looked like the angler had caught some kind of alien. Turned out it wasn't that bad. The monster was most likely a type of worm goby. That is, a fish that has quite a few similar relatives with interesting features. For example, they can survive out of water for a considerable time by taking air into their bronchial chambers, and most likely they can even move around on land. Such creatures are amphidromas. That is, they regularly migrate between freshwater and the sea. But unlike similar animals, they do so not for the breeding purposes. In their lifetime, amphidromous creatures can travel more than 62 miles. That's a lot for someone with no legs and which is not a snake. Gobies breed in freshwater but feed and grow in saltwater for several months, after which they return to freshwater to keep feeding and growing, and then breed again. As a result, one can find them in all kinds of water, whether it's brackish, salt, or fresh. And yes, it may seem that the ugly way this fish looks is the result of some nasty genetic disease, though actually, that's just the way it looks. And it works for the fish. As ugly as the ridges on its face may be, they're covered with sensory structures that help fish navigate the surrounding silt. This also explains why the fish has no eyes. As in the deep sea, vision is not particularly useful in murky water. Some gobies also have very sensitive fins. I'm serious. Scientists have analyzed them and concluded that the fins of a round goby are sort of like human fingers. The research team collected several gobies from Lake Michigan and brought them to their lab, where they set up a fish tank filled with objects of various textures. The gobies were released into the water and the scientists started to observe them. Turned out that the fish used their fins to identify different surfaces. In some cases, the gobies even brushed their fins over different materials, similar to a person who's grazing a surface with his hand. Even more impressive is the fact that these fish were able to feel very small details. Even though their fins aren't like our limbs, their evolutionary purpose is different. Actually, I just realized something. Usually people try to have as little contact with the scarier fish as possible. Maybe that's why gobies that look like creepy monsters aren't caught often for food. But not in Japan or Thailand. Another type of goby, or warasubo as it's called in Japanese, is a unique creature that can be found in Japan's Ariake Sea, although it's also found in other parts of Asia. It looks scary with its large head and long body and its teeth. Well, that's quite a creepy creature. In Japan, however, this fish is a delicacy that can be cooked in many different ways. Warasubo is grilled, dried, ground into a powder to make a hearty soup, and even used as an extra flavoring to a cup of hot sake. It's said to be a very flavorful treat that only gets tastier as you chew it. Actually, the Japanese use scary fish much more often than one might imagine. Take the city of Saga, for example. It attracts about 15 million tourists annually with its balloon festival, but this is not enough to support the weakening local economy, and so the city decided to use carnivorous, alien-looking snakes as promotion, or rather, short horror movies about them. On the one hand, the gobies I just told you about are perfectly harmless, although they indeed look creepy. On the other hand, the idea to film movies is crazy enough to actually work. Japan has a thriving horror culture, and the idea of confronting the alien of Ariake might resonate with domestic travelers. Actually, it's already working. The ads generated about $1 million. Not only the Japanese have noticed the resemblance of the gobies to the famous aliens, on social media, many users have compared the fish to the xenomorph, the monstrous creature from the Alien movie and its sequels. If you think about it, the gobies really do look like baby xenomorphs, and their third stage of development. Yes, the ones that burst out of their host's chest, leaving a bloody mess behind. Fortunately for us, gobies are much smaller, feed on small fish and crustaceans, and reproduce without human help, even if they meet them along the way. And no, the creators of Alien were not inspired by gobies, even though these creatures are frickin' weird and incredibly creepy. The movie's so impressive that there are many documentaries and books that explore the origins and sources of inspiration that led to the final product. For example, screenwriter Dan O'Bannon's childhood was one of the sources of inspiration for the creators of the iconic movie. Growing up on the family farm in Missouri, he was very fond of insects, which is reflected in the metamorphosis throughout the film, during which the alien gradually becomes more powerful. O'Bannon also suffered from Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease. The screenwriter described the experience as feeling like something was bubbling up inside and trying to get out. Does this sound familiar? Xenomorph eggs were directly inspired by female reproductive organs, slightly modified to avoid censorship. Ridley Scott is said to personally make sure it wasn't too obvious to the viewers, and yet remained realistic enough to induce fear. Facehugger, the parasite that attaches itself to its victim's head to incubate an embryo, is based on the bones and muscles of the human hand and male genitalia. A spring-like tail has been added to emphasize its quick movements. Finally, the full-grown xenomorph was based on the 1976 artwork Necronum 4, created by the Swiss surrealist artist Hans Rudi Geiger. This work depicts a female figure made up of various parts of insects, vertebrates, and even fossils such as sea lilies, which are about 300 million years old. The alien's life cycle from egg to queen shown in the sequel can be seen as a direct reference to the life cycle of real animals, and more precisely to a particular wasp family. Ichneumonidae are parasitoid wasps that feed on insects such as caterpillars or beetles. The adult female wasp lays eggs inside the host, and once inside, the eggs grow and turn into larvae, which then eat the host from the inside out. Somewhere along the way, the host dies or remains in a state close to death, until finally, the little wasp spins a cocoon around or inside the host and then emerges from it as an adult wasp. But let's leave the fictional xenomorphs alone and get back to the real gobies. If you've already wondered why you've never heard of these creatures, there's a perfectly logical reason. Most of them can be pretty hard to catch, except for the ones that are eaten in Japan, I guess. So in order to study these fish, you really have to catch them first. But traditional research equipment doesn't help when it comes to the muddy bottom. So some gobies remain a mystery to scientists, such as the worms of death that live in the rivers of the Northern Territory in Australia. What we know about other species of this family is that they feed on crustaceans and small fish. However, very little is known about their breeding and reproductive habits, as well as habitat and behavior. Researchers have even launched a science project involving citizens to try and learn more about this elusive goby species. They're asking people to contact scientists if they encounter the mysterious gobies or accidentally catch them. And it's not really that surprising. The last 3 goby species were identified only in 2021. Can you imagine how many other unknown species are swimming out there? Even the very fish we started the video with may be an entirely new species, but it's simply impossible to determine that from the video. Well, discovering new species isn't something that happens only to gobies. At the Natural History Museum in London alone, scientists recorded a total of 351 new animal and plant species in 2022, from the oldest known Stegosaurus in Asia to frogs smaller than a coin. Although these creatures may have already been observed by people around the world, in 2022 they were officially named, described, and put on all sorts of registries to help protect them for future generations. The discoveries are especially impressive when you consider that most of them are invertebrates. These small creatures make up more than 90% of all described life forms on Earth. Among the discoveries are hundreds of new species of beetles, moths, stick insects, and wasps. There are also new fish, frogs, and even minerals. Discovering new animal species may call to mind the images of scientists digging in the dirt or cutting paths through dense, wild jungles. But sometimes making a discovery is as easy as getting a frog to open its mouth and find out what it was eating. That doesn't mean you have to immediately check the stomachs of every frog you come across. However, that's exactly how a new species of tropical ant was discovered. It was found in the stomach of a frog from the Dendrobatidae family. It's a bright orange amphibian that lives in Ecuador and is known for its love of ants. Since ant-eating frogs hunt for bugs in tiny and hard-to-reach places, scientists use them as a tool to get to places they can't reach. People catch frogs and flush their stomachs, causing the amphibians to vomit whatever was inside them. That's how potential treasures are discovered, such as new species of ants. There is, however, one nuance. As the only ant specimen is a dead one that was taken out of a frog's stomach, scientists know almost nothing about it. And if you're suddenly worried about the frog, don't be. Since many amphibians are endangered, any research with wild frogs should be done carefully and only by real experts in the field. For example, to flush the frog's stomach, scientists insert a soft tube into the amphibian's mouth and gently fill it with water, forcing the frog to puke everything it's recently eaten. The contents end up on a tray, and afterwards the frog can be returned to its natural habitat safely. Hopefully they at least give it something to eat afterwards. By the way, this is not the first time a new species has been found in the stomach of another animal. For example, the snake Geophis dunai was discovered in the stomach of another snake in Nicaragua back in 1932. Oh, I almost forgot. It seems like the ant inside the frog had good company. Aside from the ant, scientists found several other insects, so far unknown to science. Naturally, it's not just the stomachs of snakes and frogs that might reveal new species. Deep beneath the surface of the Earth lies a hidden realm that most of us will never see. It's a place where weird creatures live in such a dark and isolated environment that we know almost nothing about them. One such creature is the millipede, now known as E. Persephone, found nearly 200 feet below ground. Scientists didn't just randomly stumble across it. They bored holes in the ground and then lowered a trap made of plastic pipe filled with wet vegetation there. The millipedes would crawl in and get stuck inside. That's how E. Persephone was found. What a nice idea to name an underground creature with a bunch of legs after a beautiful ancient Greek goddess. But E. Persephone is remarkable not only for its name. It has 1,306 legs. First described in 2021, these millipedes reach 3.7 inches in length and about 0.04 inches in diameter. Yes, they're just tiny. But they have between 198 and 330 body segments, and more than 1,000 legs. Other distinguishing features of the new species include massive antennae, shortened legs, and the absence of eyes. The millipede is perfectly adapted to subterranean life and most likely feeds on mushrooms. While the number of legs E. Persephone has may seem astronomical, it's probably not even the limit for millipedes. Many species start their life with only 8 legs, but as they shed their skin and build up new body segments, millipedes can add more legs too. So perhaps if E. Persephone had lived on, it would have gained a couple of dozen or even hundreds more legs. But why would anyone need so many legs in the first place? I mean, yeah, sometimes I wouldn't mind having an extra pair of arms, and yet that's no reason to grow them on purpose over millions of years. Scientists suspect that this number of legs allows E. Persephone to walk on 8 different planes at once, making it easier for it to wind its way around obstacles such as rocks and pebbles. Now tell me honestly, who's creeped out by this multitude of legs? Did it make you feel uncomfortable? Actually, many people can't stand millipedes, and encountering a household species like the house centipede can cause real panic and urge you to immediately grab a slipper or whatever else you have within reach. Though house centipedes aren't just absolutely harmless, they are actually useful because they eat cockroaches, spiders, moths, termites, ants, in short, everyone you definitely don't want to see in your home, plus they don't carry any diseases. So try to let the house millipede go in peace next time. Though to be honest, when I saw one in the bathroom, I didn't go in until it was gone. If the millipedes looked nicer, it'd be easier for people to appreciate what they do. Like they appreciate goats, for example. In California, a team of firefighters teamed up with goats to create safe zones around homes threatened by fires. You'd think, well, how could goats be possibly useful for firefighting? It's pretty simple. The animals eat something that serves as fuel for fire, that is, dried vegetation. The result is environmentally friendly and relatively inexpensive protection against fire, with goats strategically nibbling on plants in a way that prevents them from growing back. An area to be cleared of plants is secured with a special fence around the goats until the area is safe. Then they do the same at a new site. But goats can also be on the other side of the law. In Telangana, India, police arrested 2 goats for eating saplings planted by a non-governmental organization, Save the Trees. The animals managed to destroy 150 saplings. Maybe they just wanted to save people from fires. Whatever the case, activists caught the culprits red-handed and turned them over to police. The goats were then taken to the nearest police station and only released after their owner paid a $12 fine. But that's nothing. In Nigeria, police detained a goat on suspicion of attempted armed robbery. Police took the animal to the station, claiming the goat was actually an armed robber who was trying to steal either a Mazda or valuable stuff from the car. When the robber was spotted, he supposedly used black magic to turn himself into a goat, but was detained anyway. When you're a kid and get a rabbit for Christmas, this sounds like a great gift. If it's not just one rabbit, but 24 at once, then, well, you can breed them, which is not too bad either. But what seemed like an innocent Christmas gift of 24 rabbits in 1859 became the most devastating biological invasion of Australia, according to a recent study. It all started with a wealthy settler, Thomas Austin, who brought 24 wild rabbits to his estate in Melbourne. Some reports say he wanted to hunt them, others to breed them. Whatever the case, the rabbits multiplied like crazy. Austin allowed them to roam freely on the estate, and the animals took advantage of such great conditions. Over the next 3 years, the population of rabbits grew exponentially from 24 to thousands as they continued to multiply. 50 years later, the rich man's cute pets spread across the continent. This photo was taken in 1938. Yes, that's a lot of rabbits. This event resulted in a disaster in Australia. Rabbits showed the highest rate of colonization for introduced mammals ever recorded. It's worth saying that Austin wasn't the first person to bring rabbits to Australia. 5 rabbits were aboard the first fleet of British ships that arrived in Sydney in 1788. And over the next 70 years, people brought at least 90 more. But it was the descendants of those same 24 rabbits that ended up dominating the continent. But why is that even an issue in the first place? I mean, well, if you've seen rabbits, they're adorable and seemingly harmless. Well, first of all, rabbits are an invasive species for Australia, and invasive species are almost always harmful to any established ecosystem. And second, these cute and harmless rabbits destroy crops, so much so that it leads to soil erosion. Not only have rabbits damaged Australia's cropland, but they've also contributed to the extinction of native plant and animal species. Not on purpose, of course. They don't look like creatures capable of evil. However, in terms of genetics, the rabbits descended from Austin's pets turned out to be the real villains. Well, or at least very well adapted to surviving in the wild. Unlike other Australian rabbits that exhibited traits like tameness, floppy ears, and fancy-colored fur, rabbits descended from Austin's brood had a large number of wild ancestors. The genes of those ancestors taught them how to avoid predators and survive in a challenging environment. Also, these rabbits proved to be very adaptable. All they needed to live was the right soil to dig burrows and short grass to graze. Turned out Australia had both. All that they had to do then was breed, and wild rabbits were quite good at that too. They're known for their ability to breed all year round from a fairly young age. Just imagine, more than 4 litters a year with up to 5 baby rabbits in each. It's like a whole army. Something had to be done about this army. Government researchers, biologists, farmers, and many others tried to get rid of invasive rabbits. This is what a relatively small catch looked like after the rabbit hunt. But even that didn't impede the population in any way. The rabbits were multiplying faster than people were able to catch them. It all started with fences. What's more, the government even went ahead and commissioned the building of a fence spanning the length of Western Australia, from north to south. Unfortunately, the fence didn't do the trick. An artist of that time clearly depicted how ineffective the rabbit fence was. Farmers were also known to destroy rabbit holes in an attempt to control the population that way. It made sense. Destroying the holes left the rabbits without a place where they could safely multiply and raise their babies. But in the end, the destruction of the holes didn't work either. In the 1950s, the government turned to biocontrol. They released rabbits in southeastern Australia infected with myxoma, an acute viral disease specific to rabbits. By the way, it's believed that myxoma was the first virus to be purposely introduced into the wild to eradicate animals. And while this virus did cause many rabbits in Australia to die, they eventually just developed immunity. Again, it didn't work. People had to come up with something else. This is the footage of toxic bait being loaded onto an airplane for rabbits. It was filmed in 1965. And here the rabbits are, yes, being blown up. People in Australia have really tried everything they could come up with. Eventually, people managed to find a solution. The rabbits were defeated by hemorrhagic disease virus, which was transmitted by flies and killed rabbits 48 hours after infection. Scientists utilized the virus in 1996, and it soon wiped out 90% of the rabbit population in arid regions. This chart clearly shows how the rabbit population has changed over the past 100 years. Each sharp decline matches a time when humans used a new method of control. Alas, since flies are the ones who carried the virus, the disease didn't affect rabbits that lived in cooler and wetter regions. In addition, over time, rabbits began to develop resistance to this pathogen as well. Well, what did it all lead to? The colonization of Australia by wild rabbits is one of the most well-known and devastating biological invasions in human history. Despite all human attempts to somehow deal with the rabbit infestation, there are about 200 million feral rabbits in Australia today. They still threaten about 300 plant and animal species and cost the economy $200 million in agricultural damage each year. The idea of rabbits taking over Australia is both scary and bizarre. But there's also this phenomenon called a mouse plague that's equally unsettling and strange. A couple of years ago, on their way back to their home after a long trip, a family of farmers suddenly saw a lot of white spots on the dark roadway. The farmers soon realized it was mice. Upon reaching their home, they discovered that it had become uninhabitable. The mice had chewed their way into the pantry and ruined all the food they could reach. Look at that! Here are mouse feces lying right on the kitchen floor. The whole bed is covered in it too. And here's a nasty surprise under the blanket. The rodents even chewed through the insulation around the engine wiring in 2 tractors and ruined the hay bales. The house was in such disrepair that the couple had to sleep in their camper. And even 6 months after they got back, they were still cleaning up the mess. But the worst part is that this family is not the only one which suffered mice infestation. According to a 2021 article, Eastern Australia is actually experiencing one of the worst mouse plagues in human history. Mice have reportedly been biting people in hospital beds. The population of one prison had to be relocated after mice chewed through the facility's electrical infrastructure. We found reports of these furry pests running around school classrooms. And farmers fear the damage to crops will exceed $1 billion Australian dollars. Here, the mice chewed through the threads that bind the hay in the bales. And in March 2021, mice were stripping food and other items off the shelves of a supermarket near Sydney. But people began to fear for their health for real when mice killed by poison baits were found in drinking water tanks. Yes, to address rodent problems, people employ baits, resulting in an abundance of dead mice that spread across the ground, looking like some sort of carpet. Homeowners who set traps reported catching 500 to 600 mice a night. You get it, right? That's how many mice one could harvest in just one night. Now imagine how many rodents are actually out there if that's just the ones you managed to catch in a short period of time. But as awful as it sounds, mouse plagues aren't something Australia has never seen before. If we look at the data from the 1900s, it becomes clear. Similar outbreaks occur in different regions every 4 to 5 years. However, the 2021 plague seems to be the worst one on record. The main reason for that is believed to be the abundance of food after a warm and humid summer. After several years of severe drought, culminating in the devastating wildfires of 2019-2020, Eastern Australia had plenty of rainfall for most of 2020, especially in agricultural areas. Mice seem to have taken advantage of the situation to multiply at a frightening rate. Scientists have even estimated that when mice gather around food sources during the plague, their population can reach densities as high as 3,000 mice per hectare. And that's given that mice are actually an invasive species too. They most likely arrived in Australia as stowaways aboard the first fleet of British colonists in 1788. The rodents needed some time to settle in a new place, and in 1871 the first mouse plague occurred. It was localized, but by 1917 a much larger plague had occurred, and they've been occurring more often since then. Needless to say, this begs the question: if people couldn't handle rabbits, can we at least stop mice? Well, there is, in fact, a way. All you have to do is stop growing wheat completely and the mouse plague outbreaks will stop. But try suggesting that to the Australian government. They'll laugh at you, and it's not hard to see why. Growing food is too important for our survival. And since mice eat the same food too, well, it looks like Australia is stuck in this loop for a very, very long time. But you know what sounds even stranger than Australia stuck in a mouse plague loop? The fact that Australia declared war on the emu in 1932. No, really. Soldiers with machine guns were deployed to fight the flightless birds. But what did the emu do to deserve that? Well, it all started after the Great Depression. Farmers in Western Australia were having a tough time with their crops, and things only got worse with the arrival of some 20,000 emus. These birds were protected as a native species until 1922, but after that they were classified as vermin. The behavior of the emus didn't change in any way. They migrated from coastal areas inland every year, each time for the purpose of breeding. But then the 20,000 birds suddenly realized that the newly cultivated farmland was a great place to feed and raise their offspring. This really looks like a good place for that, but just check this out. It looks like the area was damaged by locusts or fire, but it was actually the emus that did it. The farmers were clearly unhappy that their wheat crops were being destroyed. In addition, the emus were damaging the fences set up to fend off the rabbits. Yes, the rabbit infestation was happening at the same time. Being an Australian farmer is sure hard. That's how many emus gathered near the rabbit fence. No wonder they became an issue. Eventually, the farmers asked the government for help, and since many farmers were former World War I soldiers, they asked for permission to use machine guns. A real army went to war with the emu. During the first 6 days of the war, 2,500 rounds were fired. The emu didn't incur substantial losses despite being shot multiple times. The number of birds killed is unclear. One report indicates only 50 birds, while others put this figure at 200 to 500. The military noted that the birds managed to escape even with severe wounds. Keep in mind, they actually fired guns like this, and still the emus survived. Here's how Major Meredith spoke of his opponents. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it'd face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. But you know what the best part is? People hardened by World War I went to war with emus and lost. Lots of ammo was wasted, vehicles were constantly breaking down, weapons were jamming. Eventually, after 38 days of intense fighting, the army was asked to call off the Great Emu War. Instead, the Australian government decided to supply farmers with free ammunition as needed to handle the emu problem. They offered rewards for every emu killed, along with a promise to construct a protective wall spanning 124 miles to shield the farmers. Spoiler alert, the wall was never built. Turns out that it was the emu who emerged victorious in the war in 1932. These birds are still found in large numbers in Australia, and the story of their confrontation with humans is worthy of being adapted into a film. But hold on, because the confrontations between Australians and animals don't stop there. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that's just the beginning. We also got camels thrown into the mix. You don't really associate camels with Australia. Believe it or not, Australia boasts the highest count of wild camels worldwide, and we're talking about thousands of them striding across the country. But this was not always the case. Camels were not native to Australia, but were brought here by the British settlers from India and Afghanistan in the 19th century. Actually, such a decision was quite logical. One had to have a suitable means of transportation to move across the continent with many arid and desert areas. Camels did an excellent job. With their help, people were able to venture on expeditions to the farthest corners of the continent. This illustration from the book shows one such expedition. The book was published in 1873. And these camel trains helped people carry goods through hard-to-reach places. Yes, that's what this mode of transportation was actually called, camel trains. This camel holds the record for traveling 600 miles without water. The photo was captured back in 1895, and just the idea of undertaking such a long journey without water makes me thirsty. Overall, camels were a popular mode of transport. They were brought to Australia in huge numbers. It's estimated that at least 15,000 camels arrived in Australia between 1870 and 1900. They were used for literally everything that involved traveling or transporting goods. Here's a photo that was taken in 1928. A camel train helps move an entire building. But times were changing, and by the early 20th century, automobile transportation was becoming more and more popular. Keeping camels that weren't used was too expensive, and many owners began simply letting them go. Perhaps some other animals would have simply died in the Australian climate or managed to barely adapt, except that everything worked out perfectly for the camels. They literally found their place in life and multiplied, turning into a large population that still exists today. Although their impact on the environment is not as severe compared to other pests introduced to Australia, camels eat over 80% of the available plant species. They pollute water bodies, contribute to soil erosion, damage fences, and drinkers for cattle. It's hard to believe that such destruction could be caused by a camel and not by some angry rhino who got into a fight with a tipsy elephant. But yeah, it was a camel that did it. Among other things, camels damage infrastructure, such as faucets, pumps, and toilets, because they perceive them as a source of water. They can smell water up to 3 miles away and are even attracted to the moisture condensed by air conditioners. This drinker here is intended for livestock, and yet wild camels drink from it too. The camels drink a huge amount of water not meant for them, up to 53 gallons in a few minutes, and destroy the infrastructure to find even more sources of water. Eventually, Australia declared camels vermin and now treats them as an invasive species whose spread needs to be stopped urgently. Culling programs have been launched randomly over the years. Most often it's aerial culling, that is, snipers from helicopters simply shoot the animals down. Camel carcasses are left to lie in the sun and decompose. Can you imagine the air temperature in Australia? It's been estimated that by 2012, about 75,000 camels were being killed each year in Australia. And yet, as of 2020, Australia still has the largest number of wild camels, with an estimated population of about 300,000. Now check this out. This industrial refrigerator is filled with camel carcasses, which will basically become delicious and nutritious food in the future. So why not simply eat all the invasive camels? I get that it seems harsh, but if we have to shoot down the animals, we should at least make sure the meat won't go to waste, don't you think? In fact, people who cull camels are even getting inquiries from other countries. Many want to buy camel meat. Several obstacles, including logistical issues and high costs, have prevented trading from taking place thus far. Generally speaking, the idea of eating invasive species as a means of controlling them has become popular in the last decade. The logic is pretty simple. Just as people used to eat some native animal species before they went extinct, they could probably do the same with pests. That's what they're doing in Florida, catching invasive lionfish and then serving them up in restaurants. But building an economy on wild species is risky. The more animals you kill, the harder it is to do it, because you just run out of them. And that essentially causes supply issues. There are projects and facilities in Australia that use invasive species for cooking, but there are too few of them to solve the problem. For example, these olives are grown on wild trees that have spread uncontrollably through Australia. Oil is made from them, and it helps stop the invasion. And here's a dish served in a Melbourne restaurant. It's made with invasive sea urchins. But all this isn't enough to deal with the species taking over Australia anyway. Generally speaking, when you think about it, there are so many human-introduced species in Australia, it can blow one's mind. And some of them are completely unexpected. For example, the most devastating species is probably the red fox. Since European settlement, mainland Australia has lost at least 20 mammal species, far more than any other country in the same time period. All we have left of these animals are just illustrations. In the vast areas of southern mainland Australia, there are simply no native medium-sized mammals left, only limitless numbers of foxes and rabbits. Were the red foxes the only ones responsible for this extinction, or did they have accomplices? I don't mean other predators, but some other factors. Well, they may have had some role to play, but all research suggests that red foxes were the main cause of many extinctions. Remember rabbits? One might wonder, why wouldn't foxes hunt them? Oh, they did, and they still keep doing that. Here's a fox catching an invasive rabbit, but it doesn't do people any good at all. Since there are a lot of rabbits, it means that the foxes will always be provided with food, and they'll continue to multiply. Unfortunately, no amount of rabbits will keep these predators from hunting lambs and poultry either. Defenseless lambs are a favorite food of foxes that sneak into farms. Turns out that the environmental and agricultural impact of red foxes and the effort that goes into trying to reduce that impact is costing Australia more than $200 million a year. And guess what? People are also to blame for the introduction of red foxes in Australia. I mean, these animals didn't sneak onto ships, they were brought here on purpose. Victorian settlers eager to indulge the noble sport of fox hunting have brought in and released these animals here many times since the 1840s. All these people were members of Australian hunting clubs. They just wanted to entertain themselves and had no idea how serious a problem they would create for their descendants. For several decades, foxes didn't take off in Australia until 1874. Boom! Their population began to skyrocket, and the red foxes soon spread across the country like wildfire. Typically, it's incredibly challenging to undo the colonization of an area by any species. I mean, there are some options, but they're quite limited. You've already realized that they almost never work. However, do you know what would happen if, by some miracle, Australia managed to exterminate the red foxes? The country would be dominated by cats. Over 230 years since they appeared on the continent, feral cats have wiped out more than a dozen species that had lived alongside humans for thousands of years. Other species have been pushed to the brink of extinction, also because of the cats. Cats arrived in Australia with the first European settlers in 1788, and then within 70 years spread across the country. Cats now inhabit almost all of Australia. On average, about 2.8 million feral cats roam the continent, but experts say that number could rise to 5.6 million. Every year, each individual feral cat in Australia kills 390 mammals, 225 reptiles, and 130 birds. Keep in mind, there are many cats out there. Native Australian wildlife faces a staggering threat as cats alone eliminate around 1.4 billion animals in Australia annually, a number comparable to the tragic toll inflicted by the catastrophic wildfires of 2019-2020. Remarkably, these feline predators achieve this without the use of fire, relying solely on their cute faces and soft paws. This cat caught a major Mitchell's cockatoo, a rare bird that's an endangered species in Australia, and no, the cat's not bothered by that fact. As you've realized now, Australia is constantly plagued by various invasive species. According to the Australian Museum, more than 3,000 non-native species have arrived to the continent's shores since 1770. These include mammals, birds, plants, insects, and other invertebrates, fungi, parasites, and sea creatures. They are found all over Australia, with some feeling so great in their new home that many people don't realize that the plant they so carefully water or the bird they throw crumbs to is actually an undesired invasive species. Actually, the issue of invasive animals in Australia is so acute that it was even covered in an episode of The Simpsons where Bart releases one frog and it ends up turning into an entire invasion. For well over a century, Australians have been grappling with invasive species through desperate means, even resorting to introducing similarly invasive predators. However, all their efforts have proven futile. Australia is certainly not the only country with invasive creatures, but its biodiversity is unique and distinctive, shaped by millions of years of isolation, and much of the wildlife is endemic. That is, it doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. In addition, Australia's top predators are long since extinct. This gives invasive species more opportunities to thrive. There's warmth, water, and food, yet nothing to threaten them. The Tasmanian tiger, the marsupial lion, and the Megalania, a lizard that could weigh 4,300 pounds, were the continent's formidable predators that went extinct. The only remaining top predator, the dingo, is threatened by humans. Dingoes love hunting sheep, and farmers are not happy about it. Wildlife officials have tried many different ways to combat invasive species. You already know their methods: viruses, poisons, huge fences, and even machine guns with snipers. In one famous case, an attempt to solve one problem led to another. The cane toad was introduced in 1935 to hunt sugarcane-eating beetles. But it turned out to be a disastrous failure because the toads couldn't climb up this very cane to reach the insects, and instead of helping humans, they just multiplied and became an invasive species themselves, threatening the Australian fauna. If you've been watching our videos for a while, though, you know this story. But does Australia have any chance of dealing with invasive species? Honestly, all of the existing ways of control seem to be, well, not very effective. Unless scientists come up with something particularly crafty in the future, something that involves genetics. Wait, what if they have already come up with something like that? Okay, we need more data. Steve and I will try and find it. You probably already know about the impact the invasive species among animals have. Steve and I covered this several times. But there is an invader in the world of plants too. It's called kudzu. This plant supposedly originated in Japan, where its spread was held back by the climate. But as soon as the kudzu appears in a different area, other plants stand no chance. How does this work? Kudzu is a climbing plant that spreads in different directions through new shoots and rhizomes, blocking light for other plants. Yes, it just keeps growing, completely blocking the sun. Imagine you get covered with a huge, very heavy blanket which prevents you from moving. Kudzu works something like that. It also strangles its victims. Plants suffer leaf litter and soil composition change. Seems you should stay as far away from kudzu as possible. But sometimes people spread it themselves. They do it deliberately, for profit. For example, the kudzu vine was sold in 1883 at an exhibition in New Orleans as an ornamental plant. Then it was used as cattle feed, as a means to prevent soil erosion, and even as camouflage. People really thought they found a great solution to several of their problems at once, until the plant grew out of control. Sounds like the beginning of a horror movie. It began to spread too quickly and uncontrollably. In the US, kudzu has even been named the vine that ate the South. Of course, people have tried and are still trying to somehow deal with this issue. They cut kudzu down, spray it with herbicides, destroy its roots, but goats seem to do the best job at that. Yes, the most common goats, not even trained in some tricky way. They just eat kudzu. So fast, they can destroy entire thickets in 2 weeks. And most importantly, they won't demand anything in return. Well, okay, if you think about it, that's exactly what these animals do. They eat plants. What about a special team of 60 pros and 1 supervisor? A team that can tame nature, protect the environment, almost save the world. Okay, I mean animals again, but this time sheep. The Nashville Chew Crew includes 60 sheep and a border collie named Dougie. The team travels around Nashville, Tennessee to help control invasive species and fix overgrown areas. Because sheep are in fact 4-legged lawnmowers designed by nature, they can eat plants at a height of up to 70 feet and even travel through rough terrain. Look, why are we even inventing other stuff? Let's mow the lawns using sheep. Anyway, just imagine how cool it'd be if they could deal with any invasive species. Sort of like special forces. Turns out that while animals fix one problem, people spread new ones around the globe. For decades, the little silent killer has slaughtered frogs and salamanders around the world by eating their skin alive. I'm talking about the chytrid fungus that has brought at least 501 amphibian species to extinction. You aren't impressed by this scale? What if I say this is roughly 1 out of every 16 species known to science? It's people who are responsible for the spread of this fungus. At the beginning of the 20th century, normal human activities like trade accidentally spread this fungus around the world. Along the way, it evolved to become truly lethal. Well, I don't need to tell you how various scary strains appear and how quickly they can spread. Let me just remind you, amphibians breathe through the skin, and that's how the disease penetrates deeper, stopping the heart. Of course, as soon as scientists realized that amphibians on the planet were rapidly dying out, they rushed to do something about it, and they created a project called the Amphibian Ark. No, this is not a giant ship, but the concept is roughly the same. Chosen species at risk of simply vanishing are kept in captivity until their population increases and the risk of extinction disappears. Usually, animal advocates would rather have all wild creatures in the wild, but people simply have no other choice in this case, especially given that invasive species are almost always spread through the actions of people. And I'm not just talking about cases when people deliberately bring a wrong animal, to the wrong place. Every year, tourism and trade are becoming more global, which means we can travel around the planet. And animals travel with us, often without even telling us about it. They're free riders that destroy ecosystems. For example, this is what happened to a Norway rat. This rodent supposedly originated in northern China and neighboring areas and then spread to all corners of the world, presumably in the Middle Ages. People gradually laid out trade routes, traveled, discovered new lands, and rats followed them everywhere. In the 18th century, they even spread to the islands of the Pacific Ocean, hiding in the holds of ships, and became a real disaster for local species. Rats still damage ecosystems and spread deadly diseases. And again, people are to blame for it all. Although, let's be honest, who in the 18th century could think about things like a couple of rats arriving on some island? Burmese pythons are a completely different matter. They actually live in Southeast Asia, but then suddenly ended up on the other side of the world. In Florida, between 1996 and 2006, Burmese pythons became damn popular as pets, with over 90,000 of these pythons imported into the U.S. Let me give you a second to process this figure. 90,000. In 1992, there was also a hurricane that destroyed the python farm. The escaped snake spread and settled in the Everglades National Park. But this is only one of the reasons. These pythons are really popular, but sometimes they get too large and then people just let the snakes loose. What a brilliant idea. Let nature take care of them. Now imagine you're a snake that suddenly finds itself in a territory without a single natural predator, but with a lot of delicious prey. This is a perfect place. Let's breed ASAP. In areas where pythons felt especially comfortable, foxes and rabbits disappeared. And raccoons, possums, deer, even lynxes were almost exterminated. Populations of birds and coyotes were threatened, as well as the Florida cougar, which was already endangered even without a python threat. Perhaps this list is not even complete. Pythons could wipe out many more species, they just ate them faster than people had time to notice. People actually quite often fail to notice they're transporting not the most fitting animals around the world. Keep in mind, pythons also compete for prey with local predators like alligators. That is, they can also affect these animals, deprive them of their prey, drive them out of their habitats, or act even more devious. Burmese pythons interbreed with Florida snakes, creating super-resistant hybrids that are even more difficult to get rid of. Although people, of course, try to do it anyway, they hunt pythons, they even arrange special hunting contests, but there's simply too many snakes, and they grow in numbers. On the one hand, this is a clearly frightening prospect, but on the other hand, you know the story about China and the sparrows? Steve, give me that folder on the Sparrow War. In the late 1950s, China initiated an agricultural reform and decided to get rid of sparrows. Why? Well, these little birds were believed to eat the crops, which meant they needed to go. China literally declared war on sparrows. People made as much noise as possible, forced the birds to take off, and didn't let them land. Sparrows simply fell to the ground, exhausted. In 6 months, almost 2 billion sparrows were eliminated, and they really had more crops. However, this resulted in more locusts and caterpillars. There were simply no birds that usually ate pests anymore. Crops were destroyed, famine began, as a result of which millions of people died. In the end, the Chinese Academy of Sciences admitted that the war against sparrows was a terrible mistake. To revive the population, they even had to import birds from other countries. Sparrows proved to be much less harmful to crops than locusts. As they say, people had to choose the lesser evil. Things were different when rabbits appeared in Australia, though. First of all, because there were no such animals in Australia until the 19th century, when Thomas Austin, a wealthy settler, allowed his 13 wild rabbits to roam freely around the estate. The rabbits roamed so actively that in 50 years they'd spread throughout the continent. There were so many of them that the rabbits destroyed crops, damaged grazing lands, caused soil erosion, and completely wiped out some native plant and animal species. At first, farmers tried to keep the rabbits away by setting up fences to save their crops. This didn't help. Destroying rabbit holes worked a little better. In the 1950s, they tried to infect rabbits with an artificially introduced virus, and many of them did die, but the rest developed immunity. Then it came to poisons and all possible types of hunting. But you know what? Rabbits don't care about anything, just like honey badgers. There's an incredible number of rabbits, and people still can't really do anything about it. Perhaps everything would be much easier if predators were involved in the process. When humans don't interfere with wildlife, animals at different levels of the food chain can handle issues like that on their own. And anyone can become a savior, even, ducks? While sheep act as lawnmowers, ducks are something like vacuum cleaners that specialize in pests. They're consumers of anything from slugs and snails to mosquito larvae, grasshoppers, and various bugs. It's believed, for example, that one duck can eat about 200 grasshoppers a day, so it can be more effective than any pesticide. Ducks prefer to move in groups, so they're easier to control. This is why farmers often have used ducks to clean out pests since ancient times. And I thought, if ducks can handle pests, why did China start importing sparrows? Wasn't it easier to create an army of ducks? You know what? It really exists. Back in 2020, China was ready to send an army of 100,000 ducks to Pakistan to help fight a locust infestation. Just think about it, an army of ducks. This llama doesn't come between the coyote and the sheep because it's stupid. It's actually their protector, a professional bodyguard. A guard llama is a special animal used in farming to protect sheep, goats, chickens, or other livestock from predators like coyotes, dingoes, dogs, foxes, and the like. Yes, llamas can really do that. Moreover, llamas have been known to sometimes kill coyotes that decide to hunt the animals they protect. Although this is more of an exception to the rule, llamas aren't exactly prone to attacking, but they are effective against lone predators and just check out the statistics. According to a 1990 study, the average loss to predator attacks dropped from 21% to 7% after the introduction of the guard llama. Other studies say that in more than 50% of cases, llamas have completely eliminated any livestock losses. But how come llamas turned out to be excellent bodyguards? The reason is that they're instinctively vigilant, and when something goes wrong, llamas know how to draw attention to an intruder by making a startling alarm call that sounds like a rusty hinge. Also, llamas can walk menacingly toward a predator or even run toward it, chasing it, kicking it, and spitting. It must be very frustrating to be a formidable predator and be spit on by a llama. This llama notices the danger and reports it. It then begins to watch the intruder closely. Often, this is quite enough to intimidate the predator, but if the menacing look doesn't work, the llama won't hesitate to chase and stomp on the intruder if the predator doesn't retreat fast enough. Needless to say, effective guarding requires certain conditions. Single male llamas are best suited for this kind of work, as they become attached to their charges, especially when they're still small. This llama reacts aggressively even when strangers simply approach the sheep. Many sheep and goat breeders note that a special bond quickly develops between the lambs and their llama guard. Here's a llama that's bonded with a lamb, and so will protect it from any predators. And you know what the best part is? The llamas don't need to be trained for this. Well, at least no one trains them on purpose. Guarding skills are specific to certain individuals within a species, rather than being universal. Not all llamas possess the ability to guard, as some may simply not care what's going on around them. But what about not a single bodyguard, but an entire army? This looks like an intimidating swarm of insects, but when you look closely, it's clear that these are ducks, and ducks are real biological weapons. No, they don't spread deadly diseases, but they can be more effective than pesticides when it comes to controlling locusts. At least that's what Chinese experts believe. When Pakistan suffered a locust plague a few years ago, China suggested using feathered weapons. Turns out that one duck can eat more than 200 locusts a day. And if you gather an entire army of 100,000 birds, it's easy to calculate that it can destroy up to 20 million insects per day. When it comes to locust plague, this is a real miracle. True, the idea of rescuing Pakistan with the help of ducks was later abandoned. The country's climate's very dry, therefore not suitable for water-loving birds. However, in certain regions, you can indeed find flocks of ducks defending crops. This is a practice that humans have employed for centuries to protect their harvests. There's even a name for this technique: integrated rice duck farming. Growing ducks and rice together in irrigated paddy fields was documented in China for about 600 years, and Chinese farmers practiced it for centuries until synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and chemical pesticides came along. It's easier and faster to use them, But ever since mankind became concerned about environmental issues, things have started to change. In 2016, there was even an official announcement: farmers in China, Japan, Iran, and France are gradually transitioning to ancient methods of rice cultivation using more birds and fewer pesticides. In the paddy fields, the ducks are in charge of two important jobs: keeping insects away from the crops and weeding. They tear up weeds and leave their manure as organic food for the plants, so rice producers don't need artificial fertilizers. In short, it's a win-win no matter how you look at it. But why are ducks so good at it? There are plenty of poultry breeds. In 2000, China shipped thousands of ducks and chickens to Xinjiang, where another swarm of locusts destroyed more than 9 million acres of agricultural plots. Although both species of birds worked tirelessly, researchers found that ducks were the more voracious eaters, and they were also easier to herd into cohesive, manageable groups than chasing chickens, which aren't very good at discipline. One hen is claimed to be able to eat only 70 locusts a day, when compared to 200 insects a duck can handle. The choice becomes obvious. However, ducks are not only good at guarding paddy fields. In South Africa, they work in the winery. No, they don't squeeze the juice out of their grapes with their feet, although I've already pictured that in my mind. A typical vineyard is neat rows of lush green vines, their leaves swaying gently in the wind. Looks very serene. Now imagine some 800 ducks shattering this perfect scene. The winery in Stellenbosch breeds these birds to help run the farm. The ducks have been working here since 1984, and the estate is even a breeding program for the birds. The ducks perform the same tasks as they do on paddy fields. They help control snails and other pests, and their waste acts as a natural fertilizer for the land. Additionally, the ducks have become quite popular among tourists. But what if it wasn't so dry in Pakistan and the ducks could actually live there? Would they have been able to handle the locusts? Well, ducks are indeed capable of clearing areas of pests, but in this particular case, they wouldn't be able to make a direct real-life difference in the outcome of the locust battle. Roughly 40 to 80 million of these insects can be found in a swarm covering about 247 acres. The swarm itself can stretch across thousands of acres. When you consider these numbers, it's easy to see why ducks may not be as effective as they can seem. Anyway, let's leave them to deal with fewer enemies. There's a term for using animals to control other animals, and it's called biocontrol. Although the term was only coined in 1919, people have been using this approach for centuries, because you don't need to label something so it would work. This is how citrus crops were protected in China in the 300s AD. Yes, the first account of using some insects to control others dates back to 300 AD. Back then, in China, people traded ant nests attached to branches. Farmers bought them, put them on citrus farms, and thus protected crops from insect pests. Actually, this is a common example of biological control, when some insects are introduced into an area foreign to them to exterminate other insects that are harmful to humans. For example, this is how common ladybugs can save people millions of dollars. Farmers use them in cotton fields to kill the aphids. But we're not going to talk about them because, well, these bug wars aren't that exciting when compared to how people use vertebrates, even when nothing good comes out of it. For example, take the mongooses that were brought to Hawaii on a noble mission. The animals were supposed to kill rats. That's what these rodents are doing in the sugarcane fields. I guess it's not pleasant to see this kind of thing every day, especially when sugarcane is your source of income. That's why wealthy plantation owners fought rats so desperately that they introduced mongooses to Hawaii in the 1880s. It must be said that reports from the sugar industry in the early 20th century said that mongooses were effective in reducing the number of rats, mice, and insects. That's hardly surprising. The mongoose is a small yet voracious predator that eats everything in its path. Rodents, insects, lizards, snakes. No one is safe. No one. A really determined group of mongooses can even scare off a really dangerous predator. In short, the solution seemed perfect, but only at first glance. When plantation owners came up with the brilliant idea of bringing mongooses to Hawaii, they didn't consider one thing. Rats and mongooses have different schedules. The mongoose would only go out hunting during the day, while the rats would get their sweet cane treat at night. Thus, the two species almost never crossed paths. But this wasn't the worst thing. The introduction of mongooses to Hawaii led to disaster not only because they failed to contain the growing rat population. Mongooses in Hawaii became an invasive species. The native bird species evolved in the absence of mammalian predators, so they were completely unprepared for such a voracious foe. As a result, mongooses are now responsible for the elimination of at least 8 bird species in Hawaii. The local turtle population has also declined as mongooses eat their eggs. People have shifted their focus from rats to mongooses, but the damage caused by these mongooses still amounts to a significant annual loss of $50 million. So, as it often happens, humanity went a bit too far. This is a giant rice rat, a species that can only be seen as a stuffed display at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, as it's become extinct through the actions of humans and mongooses. These animals lived in the Lesser Antilles, and then European settlers came there. They apparently considered the giant rice rats pests threatening coconut plantations, so the settlers deliberately introduced mongooses to protect their crops from pests. As you can imagine, the giant rice rats were not thrilled with that. And don't forget other predators that came to the islands with humans like dogs and cats. The felling of trees was also a factor. Anyway, the remaining giant rice rats died in the early 20th century. The situation around owls wasn't always as heartbreaking, or rather, it started with problems. To make room for cultivated land, trees and other smaller plants are often eliminated, but deforestation pushes many animals out of their homes. There's a big downside to this, and not just because the animals are suffering. Some of them are natural predators who control the pest population. Once the land was cleared for agricultural purposes in a small farming village in Indonesia, a significant number of rats and mice appeared. Despite the villagers' relentless efforts to eliminate these unwanted visitors, nothing seemed to do the trick. Finally, one resourceful farmer decided to harness the power of nature by introducing owls onto his property. After all, owls possess remarkable rodent hunting abilities, with a single barn owl capable of catching around 1,000 small critters within a year, and it really worked. However, the farmer didn't stop there. He set up the Natural Predator Program. The owls are now busy catching rats and mice in the fields around the village of Tologowiru. He's also breeding owls in the village. In about 4 months, the young birds are released into the wild. And in 2011, the farmer began installing special boxes in which the owls live. Similar boxes can be found in California, where the barn owls help protect vineyards from rodents. But back to Hawaii. When mongooses didn't do the trick in the 1950s, people decided to get barn owls there. They were released for the same purpose, to control the population of rats in the sugarcane fields. Along with owls, they also brought herons as a solution for the flies that plagued the cattle. But something went wrong again. This baby barn owl was photographed flying out of the underground nest of the gadfly petrel, an endemic Hawaiian bird. And this is what the researchers found in the nest the next day. This was all that was left of the poor gadfly petrel. Yes, the barn owls forgot about rodents and started hunting endemic bird species that were not prepared for the arrival of predators. This problem is still relevant today, and people are trying to figure out what to do about it. It's necessary to save the local species and to cause as little harm to the barn owls as possible. After all, it's not their fault they were brought to the islands. However, people took their efforts with starlings to the next level, introducing these birds to various parts of the world. Just like always, no one expected any trouble, as it seemed like a great idea. The common starling was introduced to Australia to help control crop-damaging insects. The first settlers looked forward to their arrival, believing that the birds would also be useful in pollinating flax, the staple crop of the area. They even set up nests for starlings on farms and near crops. That's how much people wanted these birds nearby. In 1857, starlings were introduced to Melbourne, and 2 decades later to Sydney. Imagine everyone's surprise when it turned out that they do more harm than good. That's because starlings are voracious birds that gladly eat fruits and seeds, the very things they're supposed to be protecting. Starlings are also quite aggressive, not afraid to fight other birds for food and territory. They also occupy both nesting sites and even the nests themselves, so that other species have trouble raising chicks. Eventually, starlings have greatly increased their numbers in just a couple of decades, and now fly around the continent in huge, scary flocks with 3,000 starlings in each. By the 1920s, starlings were widespread in Victoria, Queensland, and New South Wales, and by then they were considered pests. At one point, people even started eliminating starlings, and over 3 decades they exterminated about 55,000 of them. Common starlings were also brought to the territory of New Zealand. When the first settlers arrived on the islands, they began to actively cultivate the land. After the mass destruction of the bushes to create farmland, the ecology was so disrupted that the country was overwhelmed by plagues of insects. They were, in the words of an old agricultural bulletin, crawling over the land in vast hordes. The gathering of caterpillars was a sight that horrified the agriculturists. The insects were deprived of their usual food, so they attacked in mighty armies, devouring crops in their path and leaving fields empty, as if nothing had ever been sown on them. Overall, that was a horrible thing to behold, and one of the few means available to farmers at that time was sheep. Large herds were released into caterpillar-infested terrain, where the hooves of the animals worked even more efficiently than rollers. Yes, people were literally crushing insects with sheep. But that wasn't enough. To stop the invasion of caterpillars, they even tried to dig deep ditches. Local birds were of great help. Farmers even began to consider them their best friends. However, these birds, not used to coexisting with humans, didn't want to settle near the fields. Then people decided to call in help in the form of good old-fashioned starlings and sparrows. A batch of 17 birds was imported around 1862. Over the next 20 years, a large number of birds were landed and released in various parts of the country. But here's the question. People were familiar with starlings after all. They knew that these birds fed on seeds. Why were they introduced to new territories then? There's actually an explanation. Imported birds had to have 3 qualities. First, they had to be non-migratory, otherwise the time and money spent on their acclimatization would be wasted. Second, they had to be prolific breeders so that they can reproduce and soon defeat insect pests. And most importantly, they had to be able to eat both insects and seeds. Otherwise, they simply would not have survived the winter. So people took their chances. Today, starlings live in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, North and South America, Fiji, and several Caribbean islands. They came to all these places thanks to humans, but for different reasons. Starlings were not always brought in for insect control, but that's a story for another video. Well, if you really wonder why imported animals constantly become a problem, the answer is people prioritize their own benefits without considering the potential consequences and often lack the ability to anticipate them. The man who died from the claws and teeth of the tiger was Vladimir Markov. He was a poacher who made the tragic mistake of wounding the Amur tiger and then stealing part of the tiger's prey by sawing off a couple of wild boar's haunches, which the tiger had left in the snow for a later meal. This is how Markov made a mortal enemy. To give you a better idea, that tiger was an alpha male in its prime, over 10 feet long from nose to tail and weighing about 500 pounds, combining, as the author claims, the agility of a cat and the mass of an industrial refrigerator. When such a tiger lands on its prey, it does so with the force of a piano dropped from a second-story window. Don't forget about meat-hook claws as lethal as velociraptor's talons, paws that could batter a brown bear to death, and jaws that clench with pressure 10 times as much as is needed to crush someone's windpipe. To make matters worse, tigers, being predators at the top of the food chain, also possess great intelligence, an amazing memory, and an extremely vengeful temperament. To say that Markov got unlucky is to put it mildly. The wounded and angry tiger hunted down the poacher, and it did it on purpose. The tiger stalked out Markov's cabin, systematically destroying anything that had his scent on it, and then waited at the front door for Markov to come home. This was not an impulsive response from the animal, which lunged at the one who wronged it right away. The tiger waited 12 to 48 hours before attacking. Markov seemed to know that the tiger was seeking revenge, and the poacher was faced with a tough choice. Either leave his cabin in the woods never to return, or kill the tiger and then sell its body parts on the black market. But the choice he made turned out to be a tragic mistake. When the man and the beast finally came face to face, Markov managed to shoot the tiger at point-blank range with a shotgun, but without much effect. The tiger only got more enraged. You've already realized how this fight ended, and the researchers suspect that the predator ate the poacher not because it was hungry. However, the tiger's story didn't end there. After it got the taste of human flesh, the wounded animal began to view humans as prey. A few days later, the predator struck again. This time, the victim was a young ex-military man who went hunting in the forest. All that was left of him were scraps of clothing, a watch, a cross pendant, and a pair of boots. Experts say that in both cases, the tiger targeted specific victims, stalked them out, and waited patiently for several days before carrying out a deadly ambush. There's even information that says that on the second occasion, the tiger carried a mattress from a nearby hut to lie in comfort while waiting for the victim to turn up. In the end, the beast terrified an entire village, frightening the locals and hunted people for several hours before the authorities managed to kill it. If you think about it, it's clear why the tiger acted the way it did. First, it was motivated by the desire for revenge, and then the animal just couldn't stop. But this tiger's not the only one who suffered morally and physically from poachers. Animal psychologists believe that poachers don't just kill, they traumatize animals, driving them to despair. Surviving, which is actually hard enough as it is, turns into a cruel struggle. And so wild animals begin to lash out at humans. There are increasingly more reports of animals fighting back against poachers, packs of lions attacking hunting camps, rhinos charging unsuspecting hunters, and tigers targeting humans. Why? To get their revenge. Perhaps the animals have simply been cornered and are now willing to strike back until the humans who hurt them can be barely recognized. There are actually a lot of stories like that. In November 2017, a famous South African hunter, Thinus Botha from Johannesburg, crossed paths with a herd of elephants, including pregnant females. 3 elephants immediately stampeded toward the hunters, and Botha opened fire with his rifle, forcing a female elephant to storm in and lift the man with her trunk. At this point, another member of the hunting party fired a fatal shot at the elephant, and as the animal collapsed dead, she simply crushed Botha. This may seem just like a tragic coincidence. After all, that elephant didn't fall on the hunter on purpose to kill him, right? But the thing is, the relationship between humans and elephants has become noticeably more belligerent in recent years. Where for centuries humans and elephants lived relatively peacefully, there's now hostility and violence. Today, elephants are constantly striking out, destroying villages and crops, assaulting and killing people. And it's not just the elephant's aggression towards humans that's alarming, but the way this aggression manifests. For example, since the early 1990s, young male elephants in the Pilanesberg National Park and in the Lilongwe Umfolozi Game Reserve in South Africa have been brutally killing rhinos. So brutally, I can't even tell you the details. Elephant researchers cite high testosterone levels in newly matured males or competition for land and resources between elephants and humans as the cause of the aggression. And that's disregarding the fact that today's elephant populations suffer from a form of chronic stress, a kind of trauma to the entire species, all because of decades of poaching.
Share all my intimate thoughts, my experiences with someone, it just cuts the weight of it in half. You know, it's like a snake swallowing its own tail. Everything comes full circle.
But can animals actually consciously take revenge? Yes, there are cases like that. However, we often tend to misinterpret facts, attributing the traits and behavior typical of humans to animals. Still, the experts who study animal behavior say that some species indeed practice revenge, like chimps, for example. Macaques also understand what revenge is and, moreover, can act indirectly. For example, if they can't attack the offender because they're much stronger, they instead wound someone weaker, sometimes a relative of the one they want to take revenge on. Sometimes vengeful animals join forces, though they might not realize it. In 2010, 3 poachers went to Kruger Park to set snares to catch animals. They returned the next night to see if they had any luck. On their way back, the poachers came across hippos. And hippos, as you probably know, aren't exactly the friendliest animals. They charged at poachers who scattered in different directions. 2 of them made it out of the park safely, but became worried when their friend didn't come back. Officials who searched the area where the attack took place later found part of a human skull and pieces of torn clothing. Apparently, while fleeing from the hippos, the poacher stumbled across a lion, one or even a whole group. A loaded hunting rifle and ammunition were found nearby. Why the man didn't defend himself is unclear. Maybe it all happened too fast. In 2018, Claude Clanens became a victim of animals' revenge too. Claude was a hunter who'd been killing animals in South Africa for more than 30 years. Back then, he, along with his team, killed a buffalo in Limpopo, and it was definitely not the first time. But as Clanons prepared to load the carcass into the car, another buffalo from the same herd attacked the hunter and gored him with its horn. The attack hit the femoral artery, killing the man almost instantly. This may come as a surprise to those who've never seen buffaloes in action, but they are, in fact, pretty damn dangerous animals, mostly because they're huge. They can grow up to 5.6 feet tall and up to 11 feet long without the tail. A male African buffalo can weigh up to 1,918 pounds. Don't forget about horns, aggressiveness, and territorial nature, and you get a real killing machine. Buffaloes can fend off even several lions and will easily kill a man who comes too close and looks dangerous. It's estimated that up to 200 people are killed by African buffaloes each year. And according to Animal Planet, buffaloes have killed more hunters in Africa than any other animal. No wonder African buffaloes are among the most dangerous animals to hunt. If the animal can't be killed with the first shot, the only thing that can save the hunter is immediate and very, very fast running. But buffaloes aren't the only ones who understand the concept of avenging their kin. In the summer of 2016, several media outlets in the Indian state of Kerala reported that a male tiger had killed a man. When the story began to unravel, it turned out that a team of poachers had attacked and killed the tigress. The animal had been skinned and the meat shared, but no one suspected what would happen next. A few days later, the group returned to the same area, and the man who had killed the tigress was alone at some point. The tiger, who was obviously seeking revenge on the man, took this opportunity. Apparently, the predator was a partner of the killed tigress, and it did what it planned. The poacher died on the way to the hospital. Who else can take revenge on poachers? Crocodiles. Well, even if these predators don't care about revenge, they obviously don't mind eating the prey that comes straight to their mouths. Scott Van Zyl disappeared during a hunting safari on the banks of the Limpopo River. He was a professional hunter and had even taken foreign clients on hunting trips. So when Van Zyl didn't return, his fellow campers raised the alarm. The hunter was tracked to the riverbank where they discovered his abandoned backpack, and then what was left of the man himself. However, 3 crocodiles had to be shot and dissected to discover the remains. And then they had to carry out DNA tests to confirm the crocs actually ate the hunter. It's worth mentioning that at least 4 people have been killed by crocodiles in Zimbabwe, in the same area, in the same month. Don't you think the predators just got tired of being hunted all the time? Plus, at the time, Zimbabwe suffered heavy rains causing river levels to rise. This may have caused crocodiles to appear in areas where they normally wouldn't be seen, and the closer crocodiles are to people, the greater the chance that an encounter with them will result in someone's death.
Mama, another gator got in the house.
Another gator? Give me that shovel. Come here.
By the way, here's an interesting fact. Van Zyl was a close friend of Botha, the hunter we mentioned in the beginning of the video. Yes, the one crushed to death by the elephant. Seems like these hunters really pissed off the animals. Actually, there are quite a few stories when the wounded animals, which could not be killed with the first shot, went into attack mode. In the Italian province of Sassari, a woman shot twice at a wild boar that charged at her. But that didn't stop the animal, although the rifle was still pointed at its face. Eventually, the woman had to fight back with the butt of her rifle until the boar finally retreated into the bushes where it came from. It's not clear if this woman even intended to hunt the boar or had some other goal. Well, some animals don't really care about your intentions. During an annual fishing trip near Coral Bay in Western Australia, 4 fishermen were terrified when a bronze whaler shark about 10 feet long approached their boat and chomped on the propeller. However, before this happened, the fishermen accidentally caught the shark on the end of one of their lines. The predator resisted for about an hour and then decided to go on the offensive, heading straight towards the propeller. It attacked so persistently that at some point the propeller completely disappeared into the shark's mouth. After hanging like that for a couple of minutes, the shark suddenly changed its mind and swam away. No one, including the boat, was hurt. But was it an act of revenge? Actually, that's hardly the case. Sharks are attracted to the electrical pulses emitted by some boat motors. Usually, sharks detect these pulses in their prey, picking up even the tiniest muscle contractions. But evolution clearly didn't expect there would be boat motors in the oceans that confuse the sharks. Another probable reason is curiosity. The shark bites something to see if it's worth eating. After all, there's a bunch of stuff floating around in the vast ocean. You have to figure out which of it tastes good and which is just a propeller. See you later.